If someone had told me 10 years ago that Caleb Vance would one day be asleep on my sofa, broken and smelling of rain and cheap whiskey, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the tight, sharp kind that catches in your throat. The kind that's more about deflecting pain than expressing joy. Because for 10 years, Caleb Vance was a fixed star in my sky, brilliant, distant, and utterly unattainable. He was my best friend. He was married to Sarah. He was straight. Those were the three pillars of the temple where I worshipped him from afar, and I had learned long ago not to knock on the doors. My life was built on routine. It was a fortress of solitude I had constructed brick by brick. Wake at 6, coffee, black, work from 7 until 4, designing logos and websites for people I'd never meet. The cursor on my screen was my most consistent companion, blinking with a steady, unemotional rhythm. After work, it was a run along the river, dinner for one, and a book or a movie until sleep claimed me. It wasn't a thrilling existence, but it was safe. It was a world with no Caleb-shaped holes in the walls, because I had never allowed him close enough to make one. I saw him, of course. We had dinner once a month, a ritual that felt more like a scheduled haunting. He and Sarah. I'd sit there, smiling, asking about her job at the elementary school, asking about their plans to renovate the kitchen, while my heart beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. A trapped bird. Caleb would look at me, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, and clap me on the shoulder. His touch a casual fire that I had to pretend not to feel. He was solid, real, a mountain of a man who built things with his hands, decks and cabinets and picture-perfect lives. I built things with pixels, intangible and easily deleted. He was always there, a presence in the background of my life, like a song you can't get out of your head. His laughter was a low rumble that I could feel in my bones. His confidence was an armor I'd never known how to wear. From my carefully constructed distance, he seemed perfect, unbreachable. His marriage to Sarah was just another layer of that perfection, the final gilded piece of a life that was the polar opposite of my own quiet, grey existence. The distance between us wasn't just physical or emotional, it was fundamental. He was the sun, and I was a creature of the shadows, content to just watch his light from a safe, unburned distance. Then came the storm. Literally. The rain had been hammering against my apartment windows for 2 days straight, a relentless, percussive assault that matched the anxious thrumming in my own chest. It was just after midnight. The city was a slick, black mirror outside my third-story window. I was sketching in my notepad, a mindless exercise to quiet the noise in my head, when the knock came. It wasn't a knock so much as a collision. A heavy, desperate thud against the wood of my front door. My heart leaped into my throat. No one came to my apartment after 10. No one ever came, really, besides the occasional delivery driver. I froze, pencil hovering over the paper. Another thud, louder this time, accompanied by a muffled voice. My name, Caleb. The disruption was so profound it felt like a seismic event. The foundations of my quiet little fortress trembled. I moved to the door, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. I looked through the peephole, and the distorted, fisheye version of him stole the air from my lungs. He was soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of his drenched jacket. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Lost, I unlocked the door, the click of the deadbolt unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of my apartment. He was leaning against the doorframe, and when the door swung open, he nearly fell inside. The smell hit me first. Rain, damp wool, and the sour tang of whiskey. He lifted his head, and his eyes, those familiar stormy seas, were bloodshot and hollow. He was the ruin of a man I thought indestructible. "Leo," he breathed, his voice a raw, broken thing. "Caleb, what happened? Are you okay?" The questions were stupid, automatic. He was clearly not okay. He just shook his head, a slow, painful gesture. He stumbled past me into the small entryway, dripping water all over the floor I had just cleaned that morning. The disruption of my routine, the invasion of my space. I should have been annoyed, anxious, but all I felt was a deep, aching pull toward him, a gravitational force I'd spent a decade trying to deny. Sarah. He couldn't finish the sentence. His body shuddered, a tremor that ran through his entire frame. He looked around my living room as if he'd never seen it before, his gaze landing on the single armchair, the neatly stacked books, the quiet order of my life. He looked like a wild animal that had stumbled into a meticulously kept garden, unsure of where to step without causing damage. "Come on," I said, my voice softer than I intended. I put a hand on his arm, and the contact was electric. His muscle was tense, hard as a rock beneath his wet sleeve. "Sit down. Let me get you a towel." He let me guide him to the sofa. He sank into the cushions, his big frame looking out of place against the minimalist grey fabric. He stared straight ahead, at the blank television screen, his reflection a ghostly, shattered version of the man I knew. I watched him for a moment. This titan laid low, and felt the first crack appear in the wall around my heart. He hadn't gone to his parents. He hadn't gone to another of his friends from the construction site. He had come here. To me. I brought him a towel and a dry t-shirt of mine, which I knew would be too small, but was better than his soaked clothes. He took them without a word, his fingers brushing against mine. A spark, a jolt. My body's betrayal was instantaneous, a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the warmth of my apartment. It was a language my body spoke fluently, even if my mind refused to acknowledge it. He pulled off his wet jacket and shirt, his movements clumsy and slow. And I saw him. Really saw him. Not from across a dinner table, but here, in the soft, intimate light of my living room. The hard lines of his shoulders, the dusting of dark hair on his chest, the way his muscles shifted under his skin. There was a tattoo on his ribs I'd never known about, a compass rose, its needle pointing north. I wondered what his true north was. I wondered if he had just lost it. He scrubbed the towel over his hair roughly, then just sat there, holding it in his lap. The silence in the room was a physical weight. It was filled with everything he couldn't say, and everything I was terrified to ask. "She's been sleeping with her boss," he said finally, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The words hung in the air between us, ugly and sharp. "For 6 months. My stomach twisted into a knot of bees. I felt a surge of something dark and ugly, a flicker of triumph maybe. And I hated myself for it. This was my best friend, his life imploding, and a secret, shameful part of me felt a sliver of hope. I pushed it down, buried it deep. "Caleb, What could I say? I'm sorry," felt like a hollow platitude. "You deserve better" felt like a lie I was telling myself. So I said nothing. I just sat down in the armchair across from him, creating a small island of space between us, and I waited. I let him own the silence. He talked for hours. The words came out in a torrent, then a trickle, then a flood again. He spoke of missed calls, of late nights at work, of a sudden coldness that had crept into their marriage like a frost. He talked about finding the texts, the pictures. His voice cracked. He didn't cry. Not really. But his body wept for him, his hands clenching and unclenching, his shoulders shaking with silent, contained sobs. I just listened. I was an anchor in his storm, a fixed point in his spinning world. It was a role I had never played. I was always the one on the periphery, the quiet observer. Now, I was at the epicenter. He was here, in my space, sharing the ugliest, most vulnerable parts of himself. The carefully maintained distance between us had not just been bridged, it had been obliterated. And I was terrified of what might rush in to fill the void. Sometime around 3 a.m, his words finally ran out. He was exhausted. Slumped against the cushions, his eyes half closed. The whiskey and the emotional devastation had taken their toll. "You can take the bed," I offered quietly. He shook his head. "No, can't. The couch is fine." He looked at me, his gaze hazy but direct. "Thanks, Leo, for this." "It's nothing," I said. And it was the truest lie I'd ever told. It was everything. I got him a pillow and a blanket from the linen closet. As I spread the blanket over him, my hand brushed against his cheek. His skin was rough with stubble and warm. So warm. He didn't pull away. He leaned into the touch for a fraction of a second, his eyes fluttering shut. A small, unconscious surrender. My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. "Careful," a voice in my head whispered. "This is not what you think it is. This is just grief." I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door but leaving it slightly ajar. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his breathing from the other room. It was a slow, deep rhythm that filled the empty spaces of my apartment, of my life. For the first time in years, I was not alone in my fortress. The drawbridge was down, the gates were open, and a dragon had wandered in, wounded and breathing fire, and I had no idea how to save him or myself. The next morning, I woke to the smell of stale whiskey and the oppressive weight of the new reality. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a flat, unforgiving grey. I crept out of my room, my movements tentative, as if I were a stranger in my own home. Caleb was still asleep on the sofa, one arm thrown over his face, the other hanging limply toward the floor. The blanket was twisted around his legs. In sleep, he looked younger, the harsh lines of his grief softened. He looked like the boy I'd met in high school, the one who could climb the gym rope in 10 seconds and who always saved me a seat at lunch. I stood there and watched him for a long time. This was a dangerous proximity. It was one thing to love him from a distance, an abstract, manageable ache. It was another thing entirely to see him like this, close enough to touch, to count the individual lashes against his cheek, to notice the small, faded scar above his eyebrow from a childhood fall I'd witnessed. The details were killing me. They were making him real in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. He had always been the strong one, the protector. I remembered a time in school when a bully had cornered me, and Caleb had appeared out of nowhere, a silent, imposing wall at my back until the other kid scurried away. He had never mentioned it. He just clapped me on the shoulder, that same casual fire, and said, "You good?" I was always the one who needed saving. But now, here he was, shipwrecked in my living room. The dynamic had shifted, the ground beneath my feet tilting in a new, uncertain direction. I made coffee, the routine a small comfort in the chaos. The gurgle of the machine was the only sound. I poured 2 mugs, adding a splash of milk to his, the way he liked it. I knew that about him. I knew so many things. I knew he hated cilantro, that he preferred mountains to the beach, that he could spend hours talking about the grain of a specific type of wood. These were the harmless, platonic details I had allowed myself to collect, like stones on a beach. benign, safe. I set his mug on the coffee table beside the sofa. He stirred, groaning as he shifted. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He blinked, looking around the room, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, before memory crashed down on him. I saw it happen. The light in his eyes dimmed, the weight of his reality settling back onto his shoulders. "Morning," I said softly. "Hey," he rasped, his voice thick with sleep and sorrow. He picked up the mug, his large calloused hands wrapping around it. His hands were his livelihood. They were strong, capable, stained with sawdust and paint. I had once watched him build a bookshelf for Sarah, his movements precise and confident. Now those same hands were trembling slightly. He took a sip of the coffee. "You remembered?" It wasn't a question. "Of course," I said, trying to sound casual, as if remembering how my best friend took his coffee wasn't an act of devotional worship I practiced every day in my head. We sat in silence for a while. The city outside was starting to wake up, the distant sound of traffic a low hum. My apartment, usually my sanctuary of silence, felt charged, humming with unspoken energy. He was a disruption to my frequency, and my whole system was trying to recalibrate. "I should go," he said, but he made no move to get up. He just stared into his mug as if the future were written in the dark liquid. "You don't have to," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. "You can stay as long as you need." He looked up at me then, and his gaze was so raw, so full of gratitude and pain that I had to look away. It was too much. It was like staring directly into the sun he represented. He did stay. He stayed for 3 days. My fortress became a shared space. His boots were by my front door. His damp towel was on my bathroom floor. He used my shower, and the scent of my soap on his skin was a strange, intoxicating mix that lingered in the air long after he was out. I worked at my desk while he sat on the sofa, sometimes staring into space, sometimes making a series of gut-wrenching phone calls to his parents, to a lawyer. I became his caretaker. I made him food he barely touched. I put on old movies he didn't watch. I talked about meaningless things, a difficult client, a funny article I read, just to fill the crushing silence. I was orbiting him, a small moon pulled into the orbit of a dying star. And in this new role, I felt a sense of purpose that my solitary life had always lacked. I was useful to him. It was a dangerous feeling. On the third night, I was working late on a project, the glow of my monitor casting long shadows in the dark room. Caleb had been quiet all day, a brooding, restless energy radiating from him. He had been pacing the small apartment, from the window to the kitchen and back, a caged animal. I felt a presence behind me and turned. He was standing there, just watching me. "Can't sleep," he said. It wasn't an apology, just a statement of fact. "Me neither," I lied. He came closer, leaning against my desk, and looked at my screen. I was designing a logo for a new brand of organic honey, a delicate, intricate honeycomb pattern. "That's good," he said, his voice a low rumble next to my ear. "You're good at this." "It's just lines," I mumbled, my focus completely shattered by his proximity. I could feel the heat coming off his body. I could smell the faint scent of my shampoo in his hair. My heart was a frantic trapped bird again, beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. He reached out, his finger hovering over the screen. "No, it's balanced. It makes sense." He then pointed to a specific junction of lines. "How do you get it so perfect?" To show him, I had to reach across him for my mouse. As I did, my arm brushed against his chest. It was a solid wall of warmth, The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a shockwave through my entire system. I froze. My breath hitched. Time seemed to slow down, stretching out into an infinite, terrifying moment. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. "Sorry," I whispered, my voice strained. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. But I saw something shift in his eyes. A flicker of confusion. A question. The air between us crackled, thick with a tension that had nothing to do with Sarah, with his broken heart. This was something else, something new and terrifyingly old. The moment passed. He straightened up, putting distance between us again. I should try to sleep," he said, his voice suddenly gruff. He retreated to the sofa, and I was left staring at my screen, the honeycomb pattern blurring in front of my eyes. My own heart was a chaotic, unbalanced mess. That touch, that brief, unintentional collision of our bodies had changed the landscape. It had been a tremor, a warning of the earthquake to come. The ground was no longer stable. The fortress was compromised. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to rebuild the walls or if I wanted to stand in the rubble and see what happened next. The night of the touch, the accidental brush of my arm against his chest, became a new meridian in my life. There was the world before it, and the world after. The world after was charged, every silence loaded, every glance a potential detonation. The air in my small apartment grew thick with unspoken things. I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for a storm to break that had nothing to do with the weather. Caleb seemed to feel it too. He became quieter, more watchful. I would catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his expression unreadable. The confident, easygoing man I knew was gone, replaced by this haunted, introspective stranger who seemed to be questioning everything, including, it seemed, me. He was no longer just a guest recovering from a tragedy. He was a presence, a variable that had been introduced into the stable equation of my life, and the results were becoming unpredictable. We fell into a strange, domestic rhythm. I'd wake up, and he'd already be awake, sitting on the sofa with a mug of coffee, staring out the window. I'd make us breakfast, simple things like toast or oatmeal, and we'd eat in a silence that was no longer comfortable. It was a tense, waiting silence. I found myself noticing the smallest details about him, the way he tapped his fingers on his knee when he was anxious, the network of fine lines around his eyes that I'd never seen before, etched there by worry and sleepless nights. A small mole just below his left ear. These observations were a form of self-torture. Each new detail was another thread binding me to him. Another reason the thought of him eventually leaving felt like a physical tearing. He was becoming a part of the fabric of my home, of my life. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that when he left, the hole he would leave behind would be immense. The turning point came on a Saturday night, a week after he had first arrived. The legal proceedings with Sarah had officially started. He had spent the afternoon on the phone with his lawyer, his voice growing steadily tighter and more strained with each call. By the time he hung up, he was a coiled spring of anger and grief. He stood in the middle of my living room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I need a drink," he said, his voice raw. "A real drink." "Caleb?" I started, but he cut me off. "Please, Leo, just one. I can't sit with this in my head." So I walked to the corner store and bought a bottle of decent whiskey. It felt like a mistake. It felt like handing a match to a man soaked in gasoline. But the look in his eyes, the desperation, was something I couldn't refuse. He needed an escape. and I, in my infinite weakness for him, was willing to be his accomplice. We sat on the floor of my living room, leaning against the sofa, the bottle of whiskey between us. I had turned off all the lights except for a small lamp in the corner, which cast a warm golden glow over the room. It felt like a confessional, a pocket of time, outside of time. He drank his whiskey straight, in long, punishing swallows. I nursed a small amount, the burn in my throat a pale imitation of the fire I saw in him. He started talking again, but this time, it wasn't about Sarah. It was about everything else. His job, the pressure from his father to take over the family business, the feeling that his life had been a series of choices made for him by other people. I did everything right, he said, his words slurring slightly. He stared at the amber liquid in his glass. I was the good son, the reliable friend, the faithful husband. I followed the blueprint, and look where it got me. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held no humor. A joke. You're not a joke, Caleb, I said quietly. He turned to look at me, his eyes dark and intense in the dim light. We were so close. Our knees were almost touching. Then what am I, Leo? What am I? I didn't have an answer, but I had a confession of my own, a secret I had held in the dark for a decade, and the whiskey had loosened its cage. The words rose in my throat, hot and terrifying. You're the only person who ever really saw me, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The admission hung in the air between us, fragile and terrifying. Back in school, all those years, you were the only one. He stared at me, his expression softening. The anger in his eyes was replaced by a deep, profound sadness. I saw you, he confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. I always saw you. He reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on the floor. His touch was not accidental this time. It was deliberate, intentional. The calloused skin of his palm was a brand against the back of my hand. My entire universe narrowed to that single point of contact. The world outside, the past, the future, it all faded away. There was only the dim light, the smell of whiskey and the weight of his hand on mine. My heart was a drum, beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This is happening. This is actually happening. He leaned in closer, his gaze dropping from my eyes to my lips. The movement was slow, hesitant, questioning. He was giving me a chance to pull away, to stop this, to retreat back to the safety of our old dynamic. But I couldn't. I had been waiting for this moment, in some secret, hopeful corner of my soul, for my entire adult life. I didn't pull away. I leaned in, closing the last inch of space between us. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, tasting of whiskey and sorrow. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss. It was something far more potent. It was a question. It was a confession. It was a desperate searching thing, a collision of two lonely people in the dark. I could feel the tremor in his hand, the uncertainty in the way he held himself. This wasn't the confident, unbreachable Caleb I knew. This was someone raw and lost and real. I brought my other hand up to his cheek, my fingers sinking into the rough stubble. I felt a tear escape his eye and trace a path through my fingers. He wasn't crying for Sarah, I knew. He was crying for the life he thought he was supposed to have, for the man he thought he was supposed to be. And maybe, just maybe, he was crying for all the years we had lost. The kiss deepened, becoming more certain, more sure. It was a release of a decade of unspoken tension, of longing held so tightly it had almost suffocated me. It was everything I had ever imagined. and nothing like it at all. It was messy and sad and beautiful. It was real. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His hand was still covering mine, his thumb stroking gentle circles over my skin. "Leo," he whispered, his voice choked with an emotion I couldn't name. I didn't answer. I couldn't. There were no words for what had just happened. A boundary had been crossed. A wall had been demolished. We were in new territory now, a wild, uncharted land with no map and no compass. And all I could think was that I never wanted to go back. The morning after was a nightmare of anxiety. I woke up alone in my bed, the space beside me cold. For a moment, a hazy, dreamlike memory of warmth and weight lingered, the ghost of another body next to mine. We had stumbled into my bedroom after the kiss, a tangle of limbs and whispered words, and a desperate, fumbling intimacy that felt more like a prayer than a seduction. He had held me all night, his arm heavy and secure across my chest, his breathing a steady rhythm against my back. It had been the safest I had ever felt in my life. But now, silence. A profound, terrifying silence that was worse than the loneliness I was used to. My apartment felt hollowed out, an echo chamber for my own racing thoughts. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, panicked beat. It was a mistake. He regrets it. It was the whiskey. It was the grief. I threw on a shirt and went into the living room. It was empty. The whiskey bottle and 2 glasses were still on the floor, a stark reminder of the night before. His blanket was folded neatly on the sofa. His boots were gone from the entryway. He was gone. There was no note, no text, just an abrupt, clean absence. The silence he left behind was a physical weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The air, which had been so charged with possibility the night before, was now thin and stale. My fortress, which had briefly felt like a home, was once again just a cage. My mind went into a spiral. I replayed every moment of the previous night, dissecting every word, every touch, searching for the exact moment I had misread everything. The kiss. It had felt so real, so honest. His vulnerability. It had seemed so genuine. But what if it was just a side effect of his world falling apart? A desperate grasp for any port in a storm, and I was just a convenient harbor, a safe place to weather the worst of it before setting sail again, leaving me wrecked on the shore. The self-recrimination was brutal. I was a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot who had mistaken a moment of desperate comfort for something more. I had taken his pain and twisted it into something that served my own selfish, decade-long fantasy. He was my best friend. His life was in ruins, and I had let my feelings get in the way. I had taken advantage of his vulnerability. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I spent the entire day in a state of suspended animation. I couldn't work. I couldn't eat. I just sat on my sofa, staring at the folded blanket, a neat, tidy symbol of his departure. I checked my phone every 5 minutes, my stomach full of bees every time it remained dark and silent. Each passing hour was another confirmation of my fears. He was gone. He was disgusted. He was ashamed. And our friendship, the one constant in my adult life, was probably another casualty of his broken marriage. I had not only lost the fantasy of what could be, but the reality of what we had been. The solitude I had once cultivated as a shield now felt like a punishment. The quiet of my apartment was no longer peaceful, it was accusatory. The routines that had once been my comfort were now just empty motions. Every corner of the space held a memory of him, the indentation his head had left on the sofa cushion, the scent of his soap still lingering in the bathroom, the coffee mug he had used sitting by the sink. He had been here for only a week, but he had managed to completely colonize my world. His absence was a phantom limb, an ache where something vital used to be. 2 days passed, 48 hours of crushing silence. I was convinced it was over. I started to mourn the loss of him all over again. A deeper, more painful grief this time, because I had been stupid enough to hope. I began the process of trying to rebuild my walls, to patch the gaping hole he had left in my fortress. But the mortar wouldn't hold. The bricks felt flimsy in my hands. I had tasted connection, real intimacy, and my old solitude now felt like exile. On the third night, I had finally given up. I was sitting in the dark, nursing a glass of water and the hollow ache in my chest, when I heard a key in my lock. My blood ran cold. I didn't move. I could barely breathe. The only person with a key to my apartment besides me was Caleb. I had given it to him years ago, for emergencies. I had forgotten he even had it. The door opened slowly. He stood there in the entryway, silhouetted against the bright, artificial light of the hallway. He looked tired, more tired than I had ever seen him. He was holding a small, crumpled paper bag in one hand. He saw me sitting in the dark and flinched, as if he hadn't expected me to be there. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet, uncertain. I couldn't find my voice. A storm of emotions was raging inside me. Anger, relief, fear, hope. I just stared at him. He took a hesitant step inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't turn on the light. He just stood there in the shadows with me. "I'm an idiot," he said. It wasn't an apology. It was a confession. "I'm a coward." He walked over and sat down in the armchair across from me, the same place I had sat when he first arrived. He placed the paper bag on the coffee table between us. "I ran," he said, looking at his hands. "I woke up that morning, next to you, and I don't know, I felt something I haven't felt in years, maybe ever, and it terrified me." He finally looked up, and his eyes were pleading. "It wasn't the whiskey, Leo. It wasn't just a mistake. I know it looked that way, me just leaving. But my whole life, I've had this map, this plan. Go to college, get a job, marry Sarah, buy a house. And I followed it. And the whole time, I felt like I was playing a part. The part of the man everyone expected me to be." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "And then my map caught on fire. Everything burned down. And I came here. And that night, with you, it was the first time I felt like I wasn't playing a part. It was the first time I felt real. And that was scarier than anything else." My anger began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of empathy so strong it almost knocked me over. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a future he had never considered, from a feeling he didn't know how to navigate. "Why did you come back?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Because the last 2 days," he said, his voice cracking. "Being away from you after that, it was worse than finding out about Sarah. It was a different kind of empty, a quieter, deeper kind." He reached for the paper bag and pulled out its contents. It was 2 things. First, a new toothbrush still in its packaging. Second, a small, ornate, antique-looking key. He pushed the toothbrush across the table toward me. "I figured I should have one here, if you'll let me stay." Then he held up the old key. This was the key to my workshop, the one I built behind the house. It was the only place that was ever really mine, where I could just be me. He slid it across the table. It came to a stop next to the toothbrush. I don't know what this is, Leo. I don't know where we go from here. I'm scared. But I want to figure it out. With you. A toothbrush. A key. Such small, simple objects. But they were the most profound declaration I had ever received. They were a promise. A question. A tangible act of commitment in the face of absolute uncertainty. Tears I didn't know I was holding back began to stream down my face. They weren't tears of sadness or relief. They were tears of recognition. I was seeing him, the real him, for the first time. And he was seeing me. I stood up, walked around the coffee table, and knelt in front of his chair. I took his face in my hands and kissed him. There was no whiskey this time, no desperation, just a slow, deep, clarifying certainty. It was a kiss that said, "Yes, I'm scared too. Let's figure it out together." He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close, and for the second time in my life, I felt completely and utterly safe. The fortress was gone. The walls were dust, and standing in the ruins, under a sky full of unfamiliar stars, I felt like I was finally, truly home. The days that followed were a study in quiet revelation. The grand, dramatic gestures were over. The confessions had been made, the fears voiced. What was left was the slow, careful work of building something new from the rubble of our old lives. It was terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Caleb stayed. The toothbrush found a home in my bathroom holder, a bright blue alien next to my plain white one. His work boots became a permanent fixture by the door. His presence filled the spaces in my apartment that I never knew were empty. The silence was no longer heavy or anxious. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, punctuated by the soft sounds of our cohabitation, the turn of a page, the clink of a coffee mug, the low rumble of his breathing as he slept. We learned a new language, one spoken not in grand declarations, but in small, intimate gestures. It was in the way he'd bring me a cup of coffee in the morning without asking, just the way I liked it. It was in the way I'd put a hand on the small of his back as I passed him in the narrow kitchen. It was in the way he started leaving his woodworking magazines on my coffee table, and the way I started reading them, trying to understand the world that was so uniquely his. One morning, I woke up to find him in the kitchen, attempting to make pancakes. Flour was dusted across the counter and on the tip of his nose. He was frowning at the lumpy batter in the bowl, a picture of masculine concentration completely undone by a simple breakfast recipe. "The box made it look so easy," he grumbled, poking at the mixture with a whisk. I came up behind him, wrapping my arms around his waist and resting my chin on his broad shoulder. He instantly relaxed, leaning back into me. The simple domesticity of the moment was so profound, so achingly normal, that it almost brought me to tears. This was the life I had never even allowed myself to dream of. "You have to add the wet ingredients to the dry ingredients slowly," I said, my voice soft against his ear. "Not just dump it all in at once." He turned his head, and his lips were just inches from mine. "Is that a metaphor for something?" he asked, a ghost of his old, easy smile playing on his lips. "Maybe," I whispered, and I kissed him, the taste of flour and coffee, and a future I was starting to believe in. Sleeping next to him was the biggest change. For years, my bed had been an island, a solitary raft in a sea of night. Now, it was a shared space. I learned the topography of his sleeping form, the way he'd throw an arm over me in the middle of the night, a heavy, possessive weight that I craved. I learned the sound of his breathing, the deep, steady rhythm that lulled me to sleep better than any pill or meditation ever could. There was no more morning after anxiety. There was just morning. There was just him. his hair a mess, his face soft with sleep, and the quiet promise of another day together. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of fear, flashes of the old uncertainty. He was still navigating the messy divorce, still figuring out who he was without the label of husband attached to his name. And I was still learning to trust this new reality, still fighting the old instinct to retreat behind my walls whenever I felt a flicker of vulnerability. But we talked. We had the clarifying conversations, often late at night, tucked into the safety of my bed. We talked about our fears. He admitted he was scared of what his family would say, of what his friends from his old life would think. I admitted I was scared this was all a dream, that I would wake up one day to find him gone and my apartment empty again. "I'm not going anywhere," he'd say, his voice a low, certain rumble in the dark. And he would pull me closer, his hand finding mine, our fingers lacing together, a simple, powerful anchor in the darkness. Looking back, I see my old life as a black and white photograph. It was safe and orderly and completely devoid of color. Caleb's arrival was a disruption, a chaotic storm that tore through my carefully constructed world. He wasn't a plot twist in my story. He was a whole new book. He forced me to feel, to risk, to step out from the shadows and into the brilliant, terrifying light. My love for him, once a secret, shameful thing I kept locked away, was now the very foundation of my life. It was no longer a source of pain, but a source of strength. He saw me, the real me, the anxious, overthinking, quiet man hiding behind a computer screen, and he didn't just accept it. He chose it. He chose me. One Sunday afternoon, months later, we were sitting on the sofa, his feet in my lap as I read a book, and he sketched designs for a new project in a notebook. The sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a moment of such simple, profound peace that I had to put my book down just to absorb it. He looked up from his notepad and caught me staring. "What?" he asked, a small smile on his face. "Nothing," I said, my own smile spreading across my face. "Everything." He was the disruption that had led me to myself. He had breached the walls of my fortress not to destroy it, but to lead me out into the world. My love for him had been a secret I thought I would carry to my grave, but it turned out to be the key that unlocked my own life. The solitude I had once mistaken for safety was just loneliness in disguise. And the man I thought was a distant, unattainable star had been my true north all along. He was home. We were home.